Here we're going to be discussing the programming concept of input. Before we begin to discuss input though, it's really important that you have a solid understanding of the concept of variables. So if you don't feel 100% with variables and how to use them, I'd suggest that you go back to the earlier video on variables and just recap that concept. Okay, so let's get stuck into talking about the variables. Now in a previous video we have discussed output, and we've discussed output as a way of taking data out from a program. Input is essentially the opposite of output. So if output's taking data out, input is putting data in. So within my notes, I'm going to define input as that. And again, I would suggest that you get these notes written down on a revision card. So I can say input equals putting data into a program. Okay, so let's start to have a look at how we can structure an input statement within our program. Now we use input in conjunction, often, not all the time, but more often than not, with variables. So I'm going to start off by constructing a variable. The first thing I do when I'm constructing a variable is give it a name. I'm going to give this variable the name of town. And within my notes, I'm just going to label it as a variable name. Okay. The next thing we do when we're declaring a variable is use a assignment operator, which is always an equal sign. So I'm just going to put down an assignment operator, and then again within my notes I'm just going to label it as such. I'm going to label it as an assignment operator. The third thing that we do when we're declaring a variable is give it a value. Now this is when we start to use input. I'm going to assign a value to my variable of town using input. So rather than explicitly stating the value that's going to be assigned to input, I am going to use input to state the value. So I'm going to type in a function which is called input, and then between the brackets of input I can type in a prompt. So I'm just going to put here enter the town where you live. Okay, and again within my notes I'm just going to label input as a function. I'm going to put a little note underneath function which we're going to explore a little later in this video, and I'm just going to put a little note saying the input function defaults to the string data type. That'll make a bit more sense later on in the video. Okay, so let's head over to our IDE now, which is Replit, and start to look at how we can type up an example of input. So I'm in Replit, and I'm going to use the same example from our revision card notes earlier on. So I'm going to create a variable or declare a variable called town. I'm going to use an assignment operator, which is always an equal sign, and then I'm going to use the input function, and between the brackets of the input function I'm going to write a prompt, and I'm just going to ask the user to enter the town where you live. I'm then going to output the value that's held within the variable town. So to do that, I'm going to use our output function, which is print, and between the brackets I'm going to type in the value that I want to output. I want to output the value that is going to be stored within the variable town, so I'm just going to type town between those brackets. Okay, so let's run our program now and see what happens. So I've been prompted to enter the town where you live. I'm going to type in St Austell. I'm going to press enter on my keyboard, and I've input the value of St Austell. It's been assigned to the variable town, and then I've output the variable town into the console, which is the second line within our console. Now if we go back to our notes, we'll see that I put a little comment underneath our input function. I said the input function defaults to the string data type. So let's start to take a look at what that means. So I'm going to create two variables. I'm going to create the the first variable called number1 or num1. I'm going to make it equal to input. I'm going to say enter the first number. And then I'm going to create another variable, which this time is going to be called num2. And again, I'm going to make it equal to input. And then between the brackets, I'm going to say enter the second number. I'm then going to output these two numbers into my console. So I'm going to say number1 plus number 2. Okay, so let's run our program and see what happens. So I'm going to click run. I'm going to enter a number, so I'm just going to enter random 120, and then I'm going to enter another number, and this time I'm going to put 30. Now if we look at the sequence of our program in the text editor, we've essentially completed the first two lines of the program. We've entered our first number, which has been assigned to the variable number1. We've entered our second value, which I've just done, which has been assigned to my second variable, which is called number2. And then on line 4, we can see that we are adding those two variables together. We're adding the variable number1 and number2 together. Our prediction might be that 50 is going to be output into our console when I press enter again. So let's see if that is true. 50 hasn't been output into the console. The two numbers that I input have been put together. They've been concatenated together. Now that is because they are both string data types. So if we go back to our note, we can see that we noted saying that the input function defaults to the string data type. If I wanted to add two numbers together, I need to add two numbers that are of the integer or float data type, not of the string data type. So there's a quick fix that I can do to correct this logic error within my program. I need to use a concept called typecasting. So I'm going to go back to my notes, and underneath input, I'm just going to add a new keyword, and this keyword is going to be typecasting. Sometimes just referred to as casting. What I mean by typecasting is essentially just changing the data type. And that's how I'm going to define it. I'm going to define typecasting as changing a data type. So let's head back to our program and see how we can use typecasting. Now, I know input, it defaults to a string. To change it so that it is an integer, all I need to do is type int in front of input, open a bracket, and then go right to the end of line 1 and put a closing bracket. And then if you look closely, you can see that I've wrapped the input function in another function which is called int. And what that's doing is changing the value that you've input from a string to an integer. I'm going to do the same for the line below. Then I'm going to run my program and we'll see what happens. See if our two numbers are added together or if they're joined together or concatenated together. So let's have a look. I'm going to enter the number 40 and then I'm going to add the number 60. Fantastic. I can see that they have been added together as if they were two integers, which they are. They're not strings anymore. They've been typecast into integers.